From March 26, 2012, the following is VoterRadio.com's coverage of an address by author Jeffrey Clements on a proposed constitutional amendment to overturn the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Citizens United v. FEC. Clements is the author of Corporations Are Not People and co-founder of Free Speech for People. The event was held at William Peace University in Raleigh and presented by Common Cause, North Carolina.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Dave, and the community here in Raleigh and at Peace College, William Peace University, I guess it is now, right? So I'm very glad to be here, not just for the weather, but my daughter goes to Elon, and I love getting down to North Carolina. I couldn't get her to look anywhere else except North Carolina when she was looking at school, so I now know why. It's a wonderful place to be. So I'm very glad to be here. I want to talk about the book, Corporations Are Not People, but I really want to talk about, America, because I think that's what the Citizens United case frames for us. There's times in American history when the Supreme Court says out loud a proposition that is so contrary to what we know is right if we're going to succeed on this improbable experiment of government of, for, and by a free and equal people. That it's sort of a wake-up call, and it causes, especially when the chips are down for democracy, an amazing response of reform. So, I mean, think back to, after the Citizens United case got decided, and just to quickly recap, I think folks know, the Citizens United, 2010, the Supreme Court, 5-4, struck down the McCain-Feingold law that restricted corporate spending to influence the outcome of our federal elections. And they did it in such a sweeping manner. They overturned two previous cases, one only 6 years before that said, of course, the American people have the authority and the power, and I would say the duty, to restrict corporate spending from dominating our elections. They threw that all aside, and that's why we're now seeing the money pouring into the super PACs. It's why what was a big problem is now this huge, massive, grotesque display of money and power of largest corporations and those who control them deciding who gets to run for office and who doesn't. And we are turned from citizens into consumers at best or spectators at worst. We had 60% of the American people who could have voted in 2010, the midterms, the first post-Citizens United election, didn't bother to vote. It was the most expensive midterm election in history. 6 out of 10 of us who could have voted watched those attack ads play out and the money being poured in and decided, no, why bother? So that's what Citizens United did. And I say it's like one of those cases that I talked about in American history where it's a moment, and that's the big opportunity that we have now. Because shortly after the case came down and I formed Free Speech for People with my colleague there, John Bonifaz, and I must thank Common Cause, that's not Peace College, wherever Bob went. Common Cause has been a terrific partner across the country on this. But I went to see Donna Edwards. She's a congresswoman from Maryland, and it was right after the decision was decided, and she said, this is like the Dred Scott decision. And I had to think about that a bit, and I think she's right. And Dred Scott, you may recall, is the 1856 case that triggered, in many ways, the Civil War. It triggered the split of the creation of the Republican Party, the fracturing of all the old political alliances, the transformation of the abolitionists from a fringe into a mainstream change party, because the Supreme Court said in that case that the African American in America has no rights, I'm quoting now, this is in our Supreme Court reporters, sadly and shamefully, no rights that the white man is bound to respect. That's what the Supreme Court said in Dred Scott. So it was a proposition, in many ways, not contrary to what the reality was in America at the time, but they said it out loud, and they said that's what our Constitution stands for. The Supreme Court decided a constitutional case, and we as Americans had to decide, is that really what we stand for? Our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution that opens we the people, this promise, and a promise that almost never worked in anywhere in human history, but the founders of the country were so careful to set up this possibility that we could actually succeed with this idea of government of free, equal people, that all people are created equal, that our country is a Republican democracy where every voice counts. And Dred Scott was right in our face, and it was a fork in the road. We had to decide, could we reconcile that with the Supreme Court saying, under that system, you know, based on the color of your skin, you might have no rights that another color of your skin had to respect. And we, of course, we know how that ended with the Civil War and the 3 great constitutional amendments that really rededicated, as Abraham Lincoln said, the promise that actually, no, we do mean it, free, equal people. And so those constitutional amendments after the Civil War were critical, but they came in response to the fire being lit by the Supreme Court and the Dred Scott decision. Women read those amendments, worked on them, worked on the abolitionist cause, worked on this promise, as did men. But women then said, well, all it says in the 14th Amendment, you know, equal protection of the laws, no matter who you are. All persons have equal protections. All persons have due process. Women said, oh, good, we get the right to vote at last. And the Supreme Court, again, said out loud, no. The Minor case, the Supreme Court said, no, equality of persons doesn't mean women get a right to vote. Again, it was a proposition by the Supreme Court. We were at a fork in the road. Can we reconcile that with the idea that all are created equal, that we're a republic of free, equal people? And we said, no, we can't. It took a while, but constitutional amendment, women got the right to vote. You know, the progressives had a radical corporate Supreme Court to deal with in the turn of the century, much like our own. It was coming out of the Gilded Age. Corporate power was at its height. The 1% decided most of the rules. America had to confront that. You had a Supreme Court that created the person that wasn't a woman under our Constitution was a corporation under the Santa Clara case and the railroad line of cases. The Supreme Court said, yes, corporations can use these new constitutional amendments that 600,000 of us on both sides died for to strike down our laws. And the Supreme Court in those days, this was a turn of the century, turn of the last century, early 1900s, was striking down child labor laws, maximum hour laws, essentially any laws that interfered with corporate right, quote unquote, to just do business any way they wanted. And we had to confront that. Could we coexist as our republic with that? And the progressives did 4 constitutional amendments in 10 years. And now progressive means something that, you know, a lot of people associate, oh, that's the left. You know, it was not the left then. It was Republicans like Theodore Roosevelt, Democrats like Woodrow Wilson. Again, it fractured the politics of the day for Americans to come together and say, no, we got to, you know, we're in a new century, new industrialization. We've got to reconfigure and take on this corporate court in order to make democracy real for the 20th century. So 4 amendments in 10 years. One was kind of dumb, maybe. I don't know your views, but the Prohibition Amendment didn't work out that well. They got a little carried away with the reformist zeal, and they did another amendment to fix that 10 years later. But the other 3 amendments, think about it, because you know I'm going to talk about why we need an amendment for Citizens United, and people will hear and tell you, oh, it takes too hard, it's too long, it's impractical. These 4 they did in 10 years, 3 of them, we got women the right to vote, finally. We got senators elected. We take that for granted now, that we elect our senators. Well, we didn't back then. Senators were appointed in smoke-filled, money-filled rooms, usually controlled, again, by corporate money and the powerful elite. And then the Third Amendment, in some ways, is most intriguing. This corporate-oriented Supreme Court struck down when Congress enacted a progressive income tax, a graduated income tax, the first income tax for the federal government to fund the new, you know, government that would do things like food and drug laws, you know, the conservation laws, all the other efforts that the progressive era was trying to do to make our country work for this new century. The Supreme Court struck that down, said Congress does not have the power to do an income tax. Well, the American people said we have to have an income tax or we have no effective federal government. And you know, some people might be fine with that, but the American people weren't, and they did a constitutional amendment so that we could have an income tax. So if you think this one's hard, imagine the folks who got the income tax amendment through, right? And you need 2/3 of Congress, you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. They did it, and they did it because they had to, or we would not have had the democracy in our country that we've had in the 20th century. Now, you know, they didn't really finish the work till the court packing plan, and FDR had to finally, you know, they were striking down the New Deal, and they had that confrontation with the Supreme Court. So that's our history, folks. The democracy and the success of this crazy, improbable, radical idea that free, equal people can pursue happiness together in a republic of, for, and by the people doesn't just happen. It's only succeeded because the founders put Article 5 into the Constitution, the amendment article, and we the people have used it 27 times, and 7 of those have overturned Supreme Court cases. So that's the historic context, one of them I want to frame up for our discussion about Citizens United and what I think we need to do now if we're going to, for our next new century, renew and reinvigorate the American Republic. So the other context is, how did Citizens United happen? Did the Supreme Court just have a bad day? I mean, if you look at the polling, everybody hates Citizens United, okay? Republicans hate it, at least the ones who aren't raising money to run for office. But the actual out in the country, if you do, as we've done polling, 79% of the American people oppose Citizens United and support a constitutional amendment to reverse it. Okay, that's independents, that's Republicans, that's Democrats. You know, and I'll talk more about the amendment campaign and how quickly it's caught fire, how much pushback the states and cities and towns across the country are doing to this proposition that corporations have the same rights as we do. And the question is, how did that happen then? Why did the Supreme Court, how were they so out of touch? And that's where my book tries to show that context, that it's partly the campaign finance cases that make a lot of people's eyes glaze over when you say the words campaign finance. You know, it's a complicated, wonky sort of area, but the fundamental piece of it that led to Citizens United is this idea that money is just like speech, and somehow we the people are not allowed to restrict if it's, quote, independent spending. We can limit it if it's a direct contribution to candidates, but if it's independent spending, it's in theory can't corrupt. That's the Supreme Court's view. Despite the fact that what we see is there's no such thing as independent super PAC spending. The millions of dollars are flowing in, and it does have a corrupting, corrosive effect on democracy. I don't think anyone outside the Supreme Court really, you know, questions that link of money and corruption in our politics. And that's before you even get to lobbying. The whole lobbying system is institutionalized corruption. And you don't have to take it from me. Jack Abramoff is just out of jail, and he's going around explaining what I did was bribery, and it's what everyone is doing, and I can't believe we're not taking that on. It's institutionalized bribery, the system we have now. But the other line of cases, and the other way this happened is less clear, and it happened subtly, but so corrosively to our country, and that was the line of cases from the Supreme Court that essentially pretended corporations were the same as people. So if you look at Citizens United, it doesn't say, well, a corporation is a creation of state law that is used for limited liability, perpetual life, you know, unitary action, sue and be sued, all these advantages that we under state law say we want corporations to be able to do because they're effective, efficient vehicles for investment and business. But that's all they are, is they're not people, they're tools. They're tools that we decide on when we have our state laws enable corporations. They don't exist in nature. We can't decide, let's make the peace corporation and just do it tonight. We have to go to the Secretary of State's office, get articles of incorporation, et cetera, et cetera. It is a state-created entity. It's not an association of people. So you would think Citizens United would have some explanation, like, what is a corporation before they strike down a century of law and just let corporations spend all the money they want in our elections? What is a corporation? Why did Congress have a separate rule in the McCain-Feingold law for corporations? That's what was before the Supreme Court in Citizens United. One rule said corporations shall not spend money at certain time periods before an election to influence the outcome of an election. The other rule was applied to human beings. The Supreme Court was considering the rule applied to corporations. You would think the starting point would be, well, what's a corporation? Why did Congress make this distinction? You won't find it in the Citizens United case. Read it as many times as you want. There's no definition of a corporation. Instead, we get this metaphor. So Congress can't make different rules for different speakers or voices or my favorite, for disadvantaged classes of persons. So that all sounds true, right? I bet if we said, who thinks we should make different rules for different speakers, we'd all say, of course not. The rules should be the same for all speakers because we think of speakers as human beings or groups of human beings. You say, who thinks Monsanto or Exxon should be able to spend whatever money those corporations decide on to decide who wins our elections? And I'll bet it would be a very different answer. But the Supreme Court just used this language of speakers, voices, rather than corporations. And that language, that abuse of the English language, came out of a line of cases that really was an intentional game plan by corporations and those who control them to transform our legal and social and political structure over the last 30 years. And my book tells the story of it, and I'm a little hesitant in North Carolina to talk about tobacco and the role of the cigarette corporations, but it was a big one. It was a big one. And Lewis Powell, who some of you may have heard of, a Richmond, Virginia lawyer on the board of Philip Morris in 1970s, early 60s, and up through 1971, on the board of a dozen other corporations. He was advisor to the Chamber of Commerce, as I said, and he looked around and after April 1970 when Earth Day, remember, some of you won't remember, but some of us remember, Earth Day 1970, 20 million Americans came out into the streets. It was another one of those eras of reform that I mentioned where people knew we couldn't just keep going on the way we did. Rivers were catching on fire, literally. The air was so dirty, children and elderly were dying. Toxics were just spewing without any limit or restriction whatsoever. And Americans came out by the millions, literally, on one day in April, and they, looked like me sometimes, suits, families. It was not a fringe or radical group. It was everyday Americans came out to say, we have to change this, that a century of industrialization with free, quote unquote, pollution really meant externalizing, as the economists say, the corporations spewing out the toxics and the costs and keeping the profits and leaving the public to pick up the costs. So that changed so fast. I mean, we forget what responsive democracy looks like. 20 million Americans came out. What happened next? Within months, and then a couple of years to finish this process, we had the EPA created. We had the Clean Water Act enacted, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, Toxic Substances Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Mountain Wilderness Act. I'm going to run out of fingers. Just an entire transformation of the deal. And the deal then became, we want business to succeed, but it can't be just by favoring the dirtiest and the most inefficient by letting pollution just go anywhere. It was illegal to dump pollution now in the waters of the United States. It was illegal to just dump it in the air. We had a balance, and it actually helped the economy. We got jobs in the whole new industries of pollution control, of new technologies, of more level playing field for efficient businesses. But Lewis Powell looked at that display of democracy and he was horrified. He said it was an attack on the free enterprise system. And he said this privately in an email. There wasn't email then. In a memo to the Chamber of Commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce called it the Powell Memo. It's famous in some circles. And as well it should be, but it wasn't famous for the American people. We didn't know about it at the time. And the Powell Memo laid out a diagnosis, and the diagnosis was democracy is out of control, essentially. Corporations don't have any power, and they have to fight back. And the plan to fight back, he said, would take years. It would cost tons of money. Corporations needed to put the money together to do this. Corporations needed to act together. They could no longer just act in the corporation's interest individually. They had to fund groups like in the Chamber of Commerce. He recommended the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is not the local chamber. The U.S. Chamber would have to be the organizing vehicle and take this piles of corporate money, aggressive corporate seeking of rights, quote unquote, and political power, and essentially get more control over what politicians were deciding. And he even said activist-minded courts would be the best vehicle to achieve social, legal, and economic transformation of America. And he laid out the roadmap for the roadmap that ended in Citizens United. And I say that because he didn't just do that memo and then sort of go back to practice of law. He went on the Supreme Court 6 months later. Richard Nixon appointed Lewis Powell to the Supreme Court, same day as a very conservative guy, William Rehnquist. And those two illustrate the difference, in my view, between a corporatist and a conservative. Lewis Powell wrote 4 decisions that created the idea of corporate speakers, corporate voices. He created the technique to strike down our laws, the people's laws, under a constitutional theory that corporations were people. And the first one he did was a case called Bellotti versus First National Bank of Boston out of my state, Massachusetts. We had a law, maybe you have one here, that said corporations shall not spend corporate money to decide citizen referenda. That when the citizens of the state have a ballot initiative, we don't want corporate money interfering with it. That was the law. Well, Bank Boston, Gillette, and Digital Equipment Corporation, 3 of the biggest corporations in the country at the time, got together, as Lewis Powell suggested, attacked the law. They sued. They said it violated free speech. It violated the First Amendment. It was sort of Citizens United preview. And all these groups that didn't exist until the Powell Memo came in to file amicus briefs, to file these, and I've read the briefs. I talk a bit about them in the book. It's not a wonky legalistic book, so don't be intimidated by the fact there's briefs and legalese. It's really, they came in and they just started creating this language. The corporations are persons. Corporations are people. They filed these briefs to create this new idea that corporations could use the First Amendment free speech theories to strike down laws, and it succeeded. It succeeded. These groups are, National Litigation Center for the Chamber of Commerce, the Washington Legal Foundation. Every region's got a so-called legal foundation that is very heavily funded. You might have been hearing about ALEC lately. All these groups came out of this era in response to the Powell Memo. Lewis Powell wrote the decision, 5-4, struck down Massachusetts law and said we're not allowed to keep Bank Boston, Gillette, or any other corporation from spending money to decide our citizen referenda. It was the first time in American history that an election law or a campaign law that restricted corporate money had ever been struck down. The same progressive era that I talked about, 1907, we had Theodore Roosevelt, Republican president, pushed through the Corrupt Practices Act, which banned corporate contributions in federal elections because of the corruption. We've had a century of law trying to keep corporations from taking over our elections. First time in history, in that Bellotti case, 1978, and Lewis Powell writes the decision, strikes it down. William Rehnquist, that conservative, dissented. He dissented passionately, saying corporations are not the same as people. Corporations are state-created entities that the people should get to decide their role in the political sphere. They're economic entities, and there's a great danger they can leverage economic might aggregated with the advantages we give them into political power, and that the states were right to try to guard that. But he lost. He was a dissenter. So think about the Powell Memo. That was not disclosed to the Senate Judiciary Committee when he was appointed to the Supreme Court. We had no debate about it. The chamber didn't disclose it. Powell didn't disclose it. The senators didn't know about it. Powell sailed through 98-1. Rehnquist had a hard time because he was considered conservative. And we got this total transformation of our Constitution with no debate, no discussion. And it didn't end there. He went on to write 4 more decisions. It struck down environmental laws that regulated utility corporations. It struck down other cigarette company laws, which I'll get to. It has been used, after Powell retired, it has been used even more aggressively to strike down financial regulations, to strike down public health regulations. Basically, any time where corporations can think of an argument for why it might be speech if they call themselves speakers rather than corporations, they can get a trump card over what the rules are that we decide in our democracy. And so I want to give just a couple of examples of how that's been used before Citizens United to illustrate, what Citizens United is about is not a speech case, it's a power case. It's about who gets to make the rules in this country. Is it the people, or is it corporations and those who control them? So, this doctrine that was created by Lewis Powell and others along the way has been used, as I said, to strike down a lot of laws. But a couple of examples I want to give you. One I worked on personally at the Attorney General's office in Massachusetts, when you may remember the tobacco litigation, the litigation of the states against the cigarette corporations. It is now known, this is not an allegation, it's a proven fact, that the cigarette corporations engaged in a multi-year conspiracy against the United States, the people of the United States. It was a fraud conspiracy. It's not, I say it's not an allegation because there was a trial for 80 days, a RICO case, as it's called, racketeering case. The Department of Justice under both George Bush and Bill Clinton prosecuted this case, and Judge Gladys Kessler, upheld by, again, both parties' appointees on the Court of Appeals, affirmed the cigarette industry engaged in a racketeering conspiracy to target children, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, for addiction to a deadly drug where they manipulated the nicotine and hid the risks and the dangers. Again, that one time might have been a charge that then leads to debate, sort of like global warming debates, I guess, right? But it's not it's a proven fact. I think nobody can dispute that. So after doing this case in Massachusetts, we got a law because we knew, we'd seen the records, the documents, they were calling children replacement smokers to replace the ones who died. They were calling, they were measuring the success they had in marketing to teenagers and charting like growth in market share and writing the memos up with satisfaction when they were getting more 14-year-olds smoking their brands. It was astonishing, just the brazenness, and really sad when you think of the people, doing that work who had their own children and who, I talk a bit in the book about how this hurts us all. It kind of corrupts us all if we're not allowed to make the rules. These aren't evil people. They're people who are going to work every day and they get caught in this system that we have to be able to control better. But we had, 72% of 6-year-olds knew who Joe Camel was. Now some of you might not know who Joe Camel is because we finally got rid of the guy. But he's a cartoon character, as many of you know, used to sell cigarettes. He was the representative of Camel cigarettes, a cartoon. It was really hip and cool, and 72% of 6-year-olds knew who Joe Camel was. And so we had a law that said 1,000-foot buffer zones for that kind of marketing around schools and playgrounds. Seems reasonable, right? It seems to me you could just ban this stuff, but 1,000-foot buffer zones. They sued us, went up to the Supreme Court, struck down, violated the rights of corporate speakers. So we're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to say, stop marketing to our children and keep your cigarettes and your advertisements, 1,000 feet away from middle schools and playgrounds. You could have a debate about whether it's a good law or a bad law, but it seems like we ought to be able to decide that amongst ourselves as citizens, and the corporations who are affected by when their sales are affected should not be able to just say, trump card, we've got this new right created to strike that down. Another one that happened is sort of similar because it involved, really angry parents, frankly, working to get laws in place, and farmers for that matter. This one was in Vermont, where the Monsanto company, you may know, does a lot of genetically modified drugs to transform essentially agriculture and food. It's very controversial for good reason. One of theirs that was the subject of this case is called RBST. It's a genetically modified drug that if you inject, the R is recombinant DNA. That's how they actually create the genetic transformation that makes the drug. They inject it into cows, and it forces the cows to produce more milk than they possibly could naturally. And so that's why they wanted to sell it to massive factory farms that would create massive amounts of milk created with this genetically modified drug. The cows get sick from it. They're then pumped with antibiotics. I mean, it's a horrific kind of system of agriculture. There's serious questions about human health, lots of studies suggesting that milk that comes from those cows treated with this is not safe for human consumption. Lots of questions about, obvious questions about animal welfare, social and economic questions, because it puts smaller dairy farms, organic dairy farms at a huge disadvantage and out of business. All these questions led to this thing being banned. Monsanto's drug was banned in every democracy in the world except for ours. Except for ours. Monsanto got its way. I tell the story of Dexter Randall, a Vermont dairy farmer, who was so concerned about this. He brought these studies down to FDA. He formed a group of citizens. He did everything we're supposed to do as citizens when you have something to say and you want to, get a public debate going. And he said FDA wouldn't look at his studies, didn't care about that. He could not get them to listen to him. And Monsanto, believe me, has huge amounts of sway in Washington, huge amounts of sway over the Food and Drug Administration. But so he lost. They couldn't do it. They would just said, fine. Every other democracy in the world doesn't let this be used. We're stuck with it. He goes back to Vermont, and he doesn't give up. And he says, well, I know if people just knew this was in their milk, that the milk and dairy that was produced this way, they wouldn't buy it. You know, people are smart. If they just have the information, they'll make the right call. And he worked and he worked and he worked, and against Monsanto's lobbyists, huge amount of opposition. And he got Vermont to pass a law saying if your milk, your ice cream, your butter, your cheese comes from cows, and then the milk that's been treated this way, you got to put it on the label. And then people can decide. They can buy Dexter Randall's organic milk or somebody else's, non-GMO milk, or they can buy the GMO milk. Maybe it's a little cheaper, so it's worth buying that one if they think. But all he wanted to do, and all the people of Vermont wanted to do, was get that information to the people. Monsanto said, no, can't do that. It will cause fear and uncertainty. Right? So your wish to know how your food is produced will cause fear and uncertainty, so we can't have that. Well, thanks to the people, they did vote for that law. Governor Dean signed it, and it got into place. And they had about a week to celebrate before they were sued. And they were sued by corporations saying it violated their constitutional rights, their free speech right. And people, what? Free speech? We want you to speak. Tell us. Tell us. He said, no, you don't understand. You're forcing us to speak when we don't want to. And so that was their new theory. And the Vermont federal judge said, please, give me a break. They took it up on appeal. The next level, Second Circuit Court of Appeals, right below the Supreme Court, they affirmed it. They reversed the Vermont judge and said, you're right, this law violates the corporation's right to speak. First Amendment is violated. And basically, Dexter Randall got a lecture, and the people of Vermont, a lecture about interfering with the rights of people and how that law had to fail. So not only are we the only country in the world that allows this in our food system, we're not allowed to require that we be told about it. I mean, what has government of, for, and by the people come from when not only are our laws knocked down, but then we're supposed to be kept in the dark and sort of, eat and drink whatever is stuffed at us without being able to require that we know how it's produced and what's in it. That's a serious problem, folks. And that last case, to me, illustrates why Citizens United is not just money and politics, bad as that is, why it's not just about how much money can pour into elections, why it's not just about how Washington has turned into a lobbying playground and nothing the people want ever gets done. It's a confrontation like those other cases, like Dred Scott and all those cases about, it's right in our face now that we don't have power. Corporations have a trump card. That is the constitutional significance of Citizens United. It's saying that we cannot touch big global corporate power. And why does that matter so much? I mean, it offends me as an American just because, I think democracy actually is pretty good. I think, freedom of real people and human beings and our Constitution is about human rights. But if all you cared about were things like the environment, the economy, the food we eat, the future our kids are going to have, we would have to overturn this. This system can't coexist with the kind of government and country that I think we all want, no matter whether we're conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican on other issues. This is about really who we are as a people. And that's why I think we're at a fork in the road just like those other times. And that's actually the good news, is because it is now, like those other cases, they've said out loud fundamentally something we all know, and we all now have to choose. Can we really live with the way they propose for us, or can we stand up like our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did over and over again to say, no, not in America, that we're not going to be like that. And let me just say a word about the economy, because I think people sometimes misinterpret this as somehow it's good for business. Think about those parties, the corporations that are bringing these cases, the corporations that are spending the money, they're global, giant Monsantos, Philip Morris, corporations that, if they were ever American, they're not anymore. There's no such thing as an American multinational. That's why they call them multinationals. They're big global corporations with global shareholder structures. And this kind of system where corporations that have the capital to do that, whether they're oil companies or coal companies or giant pharmaceutical companies, they can put $100,000 or $1 million into a super PAC. Most American businesses can't. I mean, you know, how many businesses have the capital now to drop $100,000, $1 million, or even $10,000 to politicians? That's what's so damaging, and because so the laws that we get, they don't favor business, quote unquote. They favor certain crony businesses that can afford to play the pay-to-play politics, and that's why we are having this massive de-escalation in wages for most people. The 1990s, and that's why I say this was not just Citizens United. Citizens United is sort of the end game. 1990s, CEO pay went up 600%. 4 out of 5 Americans, the wages went down through that. And there's a report out right now for the 2010, so, you know, this recovery we hope we're in the middle of, and I sincerely hope we are. 93% of the wage gains have gone to the top 1%. 93%. It's historic. It's never been that high in any recovery in history, because the rules have changed. We, the people, most people no longer have the say in how the rules are made, and so you get, you know, 15% tax rates for the wealthy. You get, and everyone else paying 35. You get the hedge funds with the hedge fund tax exemption, essentially. You get all these rules that keep moving money up, and you get privatization, so-called, corporate takeovers of schools, prisons, all the things that used to be public. You get privatized, which adds essentially a tax on the taxpayer to pay shareholders, pay CEOs, where we used to do this ourselves as public. So it's totally transforming our economy and our wages, and that's why we're going to win, actually. Let me use that to transition to the good news if you're too depressed now. The good news is we are going to win, and here's why. It's because everybody is affected by this. We have a business support for this effort that is very surprising and extraordinary. So let me tell you about the effort first, though. When we get this kind of confrontation with the, you know, really a question of who we are we going to fulfill that idea that we're free and equal people, and we're going to have a government of, for, and by the people? We're going to be we the people, not we the corporations. If we're going to do that, we have to do a constitutional amendment. We have to try for it, because the Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United is a constitutional one. Congress can do disclosure laws, but they haven't. Congress can do, you know, shareholder approval laws, which they haven't. But nothing can change that proposition except either the Supreme Court changing its mind or a constitutional amendment. And so the constitutional amendment campaign is a way we either win it because we win it, and I think we will, and it gets in the Constitution as the 28th Amendment that says corporations under the words person, people, and persons in the Constitution means human beings, not corporations. It's sad we have to say it, but we do. And that we, the people, can regulate expenditures in elections so that we have fair elections, not unfair elections. And so we need to have those amendments, because otherwise there's nothing we can do, number one. But the other reason is because that's what carries the conversation around the country. That's what carries the debate. That's what forces this to not just go away as sort of another bad case that the Supreme Court screwed up, but then we go on to other things. It keeps the conversation and the debate going. And that leads to other good reforms, and it maybe leads to a new Supreme Court, a different justice who knows the American people are not happy with this situation, that we can't just tweak, we have to change fundamentally, and the Supreme Court can correct itself perhaps if we do this. But we can't wait for that to happen because it may well not happen. So the People's Rights Amendment is in the book. There's links and tools for how to use things like resolutions. There's been cities and towns across the country that have passed resolutions saying Citizens United is wrong, that people, not corporations, have constitutional rights, and that we make the rules for corporations, not the other way around, that we demand Congress send an amendment to the states for ratification. Those resolutions are going through everywhere where they come up. They don't pass, you know, like most things these days, 51-49. They pass overwhelmingly. You know, they are supported by most people. So the resolution campaigns, there's been some in North Carolina towns I know, and maybe you have more examples you can tell me about, but LA, New York, both Portland, Oregon, Portland, Maine, cities and towns in between, all over the country, this is happening. The state of New Mexico passed a resolution demanding a constitutional amendment through the House, through the Senate of the state of New Mexico. Hawaii has done it. Massachusetts, it's through our Judiciary Committee. The Attorney General supports it. The Assembly in California has passed it. This is moving through states, and it's so effective because it not only forces the debate, it forces a vote. It forces politicians to say, where do they stand at long last on this question? It's not a 1,000-page bill. It's a simple proposition. Is our Constitution for people or corporations? And that's a good vote for us to have these days. And so I mentioned the business thing. I want to say we have 1,000 business leaders who've signed on to this campaign now. We're working with businesses like Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company. This is their name. It's our new campaign. It's called GetTheDoughOut.org. So it's a Ben & Jerry's idea. You may remember the Pillsbury Doughboy when they were first starting out as their competition. So Get the Dough Out is going to be a great campaign. It's going to be going to colleges this summer with bands and music. They have a flavor, the Americone Dream, that Stephen Colbert's flavor. He's very upset because he says this is treason because he says corporations are people, my friend. So I think he's kidding. So this is catching on all over the country, and you may have heard about the Montana case, and I'll close with this before opening it up to conversation. In Montana, the Supreme Court, well, let me step back. After Citizens United was decided, I mentioned we went to Washington and talked to Donna Edwards, all that. There are now a dozen bills, amendment bills, pending in Congress. The People's Rights Amendment has been introduced in Congress. Your own representative, Republican representative from North Carolina, Walter Jones, is a co-sponsor with Democratic Jim McGovern from my state of Massachusetts of the People's Rights Amendment. There's Senate versions of it. There's a lot of good activity in Congress, but we can't just wait for that. But right after Citizens United was decided, Attorney General Steve Bullock of Montana went down to Washington, and they testified in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Citizens United, remember, although it applied to federal law, it effectively overturned all the states' laws that tried to limit corporate spending in elections. And Montana had one. And he said in this testimony, he said, the people of Montana saved our state. That in 1912, the Anaconda Copper Corporation, and the biggest at that time corporations in the world, owned Montana. They decided who was elected. They decided what the laws were going to be. And if the people don't like it, too bad. And the people of Montana rose up and they got a referendum. They could never have gotten through the legislature. They got a referendum and insisted on passing the Montana Corrupt Practices Act in 1912, which restricted corporate spending in elections. And he said, Steve Bullock did, the Attorney General, he told the Senate, that, I'm not going to be the one. I'm not going to be the Attorney General that says I won't enforce that law. The people fought for that law. I'm going to enforce that law. And so essentially he said, sue me. And they did. He was sued by a corporate front group called Western Tradition Partnership. And we know, they always have good names. Citizens United, Western Tradition Partnership, Americans for Apple Pie. He was sued, and he defended the case, and we helped. Free Speech for People led the filing of briefs to bring these arguments to the Court of Montana, some of what I'm saying tonight, and we joined with the American Sustainable Business Council, the American Independent Business Alliance, and 2 Montana businesses who said, this is not only bad democracy, it's bad business, bad economy. And there were other amicus briefs, and the Supreme Court of Montana 5-2 agreed with the Attorney General that the law in Montana is necessary to prevent the absolute corruption of the Montana state government. And so the Montana Supreme Court essentially has put it back to the U.S. Supreme Court to say, here's a lesson from the West. You guys are wrong. And it's not really technically how our government's supposed to work. The Supreme Court's supposed to have the last word. And states are supposed to follow it. Now, Montana said, well, maybe in Citizens United you didn't have all the evidence we have. We have evidence here, affidavits, all this evidence that shows corruption from corporate spending in elections. Well, 2 justices, I said it was a 5-2 decision. 2 of the justices dissented. And one of them is a guy named Justice Nelson. again, hardly a radical. He's Montana, you know, I don't know if he's conservative or middle of the road or whatever, but he dissented. He said, I'm going to read you what he said. But he said, you know, we have to follow Citizens United. That's why he dissented from this decision. But then he went on to say in about 40 pages how wrong Citizens United was. And he closed with this, and I'll close with this, that he said, after explaining how off-base Citizens United was, how dangerous it is for democracy and the American Republic, he said, lastly, I am compelled to say something about corporate personhood. I find the entire concept offensive. Corporations are artificial creatures of law. As such, they should enjoy only those powers, not constitutional rights, but legislatively conferred powers that are concomitant with their legitimate function, that being limited liability investment vehicles for business. Corporations are not persons. Human beings are persons, and it is an affront to the inviolable dignity of our species that courts have created a legal fiction that forces people, human beings, to share fundamental natural rights with soulless creations of government. And then Justice Nelson went further. He said, worse still, while corporations and human beings share many of the same rights under the law, they clearly are not bound by the same code of good conduct, decency, and morality, and they are not held equally accountable for their sins. Indeed, he said, it is truly ironic that the death penalty and hell are reserved for natural persons. So, you know, that's from Justice Nelson out on the Montana Supreme Court. That's the kind of debate that is now being unleashed in the country. And it is a historic moment for us. We have to seize this. Whatever you care about is your most important issue. This is our opportunity to actually make what we care about matter again, to take this opportunity and you know, to push on that door that seems to never open. And I think we're going to find that it opens. Like it's one of those historic times that we can come together and save our country, get us back on the track to a free republic of equal people. And then we'll have lots of good debates about lots of good issues, but we'll actually be able to focus on, you know, what does the country really need right now, and how can we get it back to the kind of country where we have a fair, effective, both democracy and economy and balance between these big, powerful interests and all of us. So that's the opportunity. I hope you'll check out the book, but I hope most of all you'll check out this movement and join us and work together, whether it's Move to Amend, Free Speech for People, Common Cause. There are so many groups working on this. If you don't find one you like, you can form your own. That's the notion of amendments, that it is, you know, I think we'll succeed when you start seeing things like engineers for the 28th Amendment, and, you know, people, it's an organic process, and it's happening right now. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope we'll have some questions and conversation. So thank you very much. Do you want to take questions? Questions, yes, right here in the middle.
First of all, I want to say that you and the folks at Free Speech for People are my heroes right now. I think this is the one important issue of our time, and I think history is going to prove that. I have two concerns I want to ask you that. One, is it possible that we could get a watered-down version of the amendment that might limit the spending of corporations but not take them out of the category of personhood? And the second concern is, do we get one shot at a constitutional amendment? Does it go through the states one time, and then if we don't make it, that's the end?
Two great questions. I knew when you come, there's going to be concerns and problems coming. You were setting me up. No, they're great questions. And so here's the situation. The second question first. No, there's not just one shot. But the first question is, anything is possible, from no progress to everything we ever dreamed of, or something in between. And my answer is now going to segue to answer, I hope, both of those, and at least say some remarks about both of those situations, because Yeah, Article 5, here's the short lawyerly answer. Article 5 of the Constitution says we can have a convention, that's one method. That hasn't been done since 1787, a constitutional convention. All 27 amendments went through the other method, which I'm about to say. So for me, some people think we need a constitutional convention. If they want to work on that, great. Any progress is good, so that's fine. But the way we're focused at Free Speech for People is to get that 2/3 of Congress that passes the amendment. The president actually doesn't have a role. The president doesn't sign this. It's not like a normal bill for some reason. It was intended to be just the Congress, Senate and House, 2/3, and then it goes through a process of ratification, and it goes individually through all the states to be ratified, and it becomes part of the Constitution when 3/4 of the states have ratified it. Now, if it were just that simple process, I think the concern would be grave right now that we'll get a minimum watered down thing and it'll quickly move through and be done. I don't think that's how it's going to happen, though, and partly the reason is the great resilience and gutsiness of the American people. We're actually rising up about Citizens United and taking it on our own. We're not just saying, Congress, fix this, please, and then going away. That this is really happening across the country. And there's a lot of great ideas, a lot of great debate, a lot of insistence that we got to get this right. And so, that's why there's a dozen bills in Congress. There's not just one. There's a dozen, and some of them are very different. Others are just, variations on the same. But the People's Rights Amendment does declare all the way corporations are not the same as people under our Constitution. There's some that say only business corporations, but not non-for-profits or unions. Others say, don't address that at all and only say basically Congress and the states can regulate the spending of money in elections and doesn't address the corporate person problem. But I think if we keep our eye on the ball, that the two fundamental things we need to move forward as a country in this century, I think, and I think a lot of people think, we've got to fix the corporate power problem so that we can actually make rules that are fair and help everybody prosper, and we got to fix the money in politics problem, the unrestricted spending, the lobbying that is out of control, and basically that's what's made what we think as people marginalized and the lobbyists dominating. But if we keep our eye on those two things, does the amendment fix the corporate power problem, and does it fix the notion that money is the same as speech in all circumstances, even in our elections where we're supposed to have a fair, free, equal voice, then I think we'll get the right one eventually. And that's the beauty of having this process of resolutions. That's not part of Article 5, this idea that cities and towns and states are passing resolutions now. That's just strategy and movement building the same way they did in all the other amendments, that Congress will only do it when the country has already done most of the work. And that's what we've seen before. So when those unelected male senators pass those amendments by 2/3 that women shall have the right to vote and senators will be elected, they didn't do it because they wanted to. They did it because the country had done all the work to demand it. And so if we do that, then I think these amendment bills there'll be hearings in the Judiciary Committee, there'll be witnesses testifying, and if it doesn't measure up, I don't think they'll get the 2/3. So it's always a risk, but we won't know until we try. And the other thing is, every step we take is going to be positive, because what changes is not just the words. What changes is really the values and what the American people are regarding as the most important issue. And if we can make this one of the most important issues, we'll get a lot of other change. And like the Equal Rights Amendment failed. It came one vote short, or one state ratification short. But it changed the world by trying, by carrying this conversation, this proposition. Women are equal. It helped make it closer to being real. And that was what amendment campaigns can do. So that's a long-winded answer to, it doesn't alleviate your concerns, I'm sure, because we should have those concerns. They're good concerns. But I'm hopeful that this process, as it plays out, will work like the other ones did to get us to the right place. Yes, sir, you had your hand up first, and I'll go right back here. But right.
How many of you U.S. Supreme Court justices were former corporate lawyers? And how can a corporation take the money I invest in them and use it against my personal interests?
Yeah.
Number one is I don't know exactly. Clarence Thomas was a corporate lawyer for Monsanto, too. Chief Justice Roberts certainly was. Alito, I think, was. But there's also an academic contingent as well. And I've read some interesting analysis about the Supreme Court, how different it is. And I don't think the problem is so much that they're corporate lawyers necessarily as that they're out of touch with a lot of things. So the Warren Court, for better or worse, was a very diverse court. There's, Earl Warren had been a Republican nominee for president or vice president. He'd been a governor of California. Hugo Black had been a senator from Alabama. Douglas had been a SEC commissioner. They had this breadth of experience in all sorts of different ways. What we have now is a very narrow academic and corporate experience. There's no political. Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the last one who had ever run for anything, she was a state legislature. She was actually against Citizens United, just like Rehnquist. So there's a lack of real world experience, whether it's corporate law or other, academic. They're a little bit isolated, I think. So that's part of the problem. And the corporate law problem pervades, like the rest of our society. We're imbalanced right now in favor of corporations, I think, and that includes lawyers, and I am one. I concede that's where the money is, right? So you see it like you do elsewhere. The second thing about shareholders is, I think shareholders don't have the power in corporations that, the corporate law pretends they do. That shareholders don't really have a great voice. And the other problem is that the structure of shareholders are so, also reflect the multinational global structure of these corporations that we're actually concerned about. And so, like, News Corporation, big global corporation, sent $1 million to the Republican Governors Association in the 2010 election, sent $1 million to the Chamber of Commerce Election Fund. This was used to do PAC spending then. And I'm not picking on them because they're right or Fox News' parent corporation or whatever, but just because this leaked out. A lot of the money wasn't disclosed. And there was never a shareholder vote about it. But if there had been a shareholder vote, who would have voted? The number 2 shareholder, $2 billion of shares, is the Kingdom Holding Company of Saudi Arabia. So, I could pick on UBS. It spends a fortune on Wall Street, or to prevent Washington from regulating Wall Street for the interests of the people. UBS is a Swiss corporation with the number 2 shareholder, number 1 maybe, is the Republic of Singapore.
Yes, sir, you had a question.
Yeah, I had 2 questions actually. One was similar to this gentleman's question about corporate democracy and why it might not be a sufficient check on campaign financing by corporations. But as you were answering that question, what you were getting at was that a lot of the money and the power is restricted in fewer and fewer hands.
Yeah.
So what happened? How do you answer this?
I said that actually. That's a better way of putting it.
Well, how do you address the issue about? I mean, it seems the problem is a big part of the problem is equating money and speech. So how do you address the issue of an actual human being with a lot of money spending, financing a campaign?
Yeah. Great question, and that's why the amendment. That's why I see them as 2 related but separate.
We have the corporate power problem we have to fix. We have to fix the fact that 0.5% are spending about 80% of the super PAC money. That is coming from the smallest slice of American people. And so it can't be, we don't have an equal vote or an equal say if Sheldon Adelson can put $15 million into a super PAC. I just pick on him, but again, you could pick other examples. And so the amendments actually do enable, it doesn't restrict people from doing anything or saying anything they want, except if Congress and the states pass laws saying, we will have maximum spending in a campaign of X, or contributions no more than $2,000 and a contribution to a super PAC that's running ads counts. Right now, we can't pass that law. Citizens United and Buckley says that's unconstitutional. The amendments that are in Congress address that too, so that we could pass laws that say, money should not be the decider in our elections, and we will have limits to what people can spend. There's also very good, important proposals for getting public money into the system, so that, I think North Carolina has some public financing for at least judicial elections, right? Some elections. Several states have public financing for elections, and it leads to much more diversity, and people can run for office without having to go get, to only answer to the wealthy. Maine, for instance, and it's bipartisan. Both parties use it. Arizona had it. But you know, that we probably need that at the national level. We need more public money in, and I hope that will be part of the answer. Again, I don't say the amendment fixes everything. The amendment effort fixes everything because we start having a conversation about what kind of country we are, and we start trying to do things that make elections be for everybody to have a fair voice, and then we'll get those other kind of reforms as well. Does that get at what you were asking?
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. So is the law currently that there are no limits on individual expenditures?
Yes, 0 limits. Here's the law. So the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, makes a distinction between a direct contribution to a candidate and a so-called independent expenditure. So it is still the law that a person cannot give more than, what is it, 2,600 federal limits? 2,500? I was looking at the common cause folks. $2,600 directly to a candidate's campaign. But you could do $26 million to a super PAC that will then run ads saying vote for that candidate. And the Supreme Court says the reason is, in their view, the direct contribution is corrupting. They get that. But they say if it's independent, by definition, it can't be corrupting because it's independent. So that's the state of the law. And it's crazy, and everyone knows it's crazy, but except defy it on the Supreme Court who decided. And that's, so right now we are not allowed, not only are there no limits, it would violate the Constitution if we passed a law saying that there were limits for that independent spend. Okay? Yes, sir.
So right now, too, like our programs in North Carolina, public financing has to be voluntary. Somebody has to opt into that system. Would the People's Rights Amendment change that? Could you mandate public financing for state legislative reasons?
Well, the People's Rights Amendment alone would not do that.
Yeah, you have to pass a law, but could
Yeah,
you then pass a law?
But no, I think, is it Representative Yarmouth from Kentucky? Anybody know? Representative Yarmouth, I believe he has a public financing where it doesn't just say we can do it, it does it in the constitutional amendment proposal that he has. And so there are some that would go that direction. You know, there are others, like Larry Lessig has another good book, Republic Lost, that he has out now about corruption of money. He thinks it's actually not necessary to have it be mandatory necessarily, but he has this idea, of, which I think is intriguing, of $75, make up the number, vouchers that we all, every American citizen would have a democracy voucher, and you could send it to wherever you want it, any campaign you wanted. So it wouldn't be necessary public funding giving directly to the candidates once they qualified. It would be competition for those vouchers for candidates that got support from the people. But it wouldn't be a huge amount, but it would add up to a lot because there are a lot of people. So it's an interesting idea, and again, I think the amendment won't deliver all those reforms, but if we keep building and pushing this movement, we can have a lot of interesting ideas about how we actually fund candidates in elections in a way that isn't corrupting and unfair.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
I know we could go longer, but Jeff will be available afterwards, but just in the interest of time.
Okay.
It's hard to imagine that Citizens United is the end game for corporatists. So do you have a sense of what their next steps are?
Yeah, I sort of call it the end game, but it's only because they've got elections. There's not much else they need to worry about. But do I have any idea what's next? You know, I think you know, let me take a step back and answer that more broadly. No, I don't have any idea because I'm not. They don't send me those memos. But you know, more broadly speaking, I'd say that part of being American is to how do we balance corporate power, and ingenuity is endless. And if we fix this problem, in another 30, 40 years, there'll be a new constitutional theory that big, powerful entities like corporations, assuming we still have them, will be using. And I don't say that either cynically or because I think they're evil. I think it's the way power works. And the way our Constitution works is that power is also vested mostly in the people. And this idea that corporations have to be kept an eye on and will come up with something new, that goes all the way back to the framers. James Madison said, and these were primitive corporations that had limited lifespans, like 20 years, because people were distrustful of corporate power being used as a government advantage. They wanted to be careful. James Madison said corporations are a necessary evil. James Madison wrote most of the Constitution and he said corporations are a necessary evil, but only with proper limitations and guards. And then Thomas Jefferson, who was always more colorful in his rhetoric, said that I hope we will crush in its birth the aristocracy of moneyed corporations. And so that's why you got Andrew Jackson taking on the Bank of the United States Corporation, because it was corrupting Congress. It was using government leverage against the people of the United States. That's why Theodore Roosevelt pushed on them, even obscure ones like Martin Van Buren. I quote some of these in the, I hope there's no Martin Van Buren fans. I didn't either. Say in their State of the Unions. You look at the State of the Unions over the years, all the way back, and there's often reference to, you know, that we have to watch the growing power of corporations. And you know, Grover Cleveland, said it over and over. And it's really only in our modern times, I think, because corporations have so much power, politicians are afraid to say this out loud because their opponents will get funded, not them, that our leaders have not been the ones to step up and say, we got to keep an eye on corporations, we got to watch them. So whatever their next move is, you know, I think we shouldn't be surprised, but we should be vigilant, just like our framers have always said we should be, to make sure that we have balance so that they're effective in the economic sphere, but don't leverage it into sort of crony capitalism favors in the political sphere. And so a couple of areas I would watch: the Commerce Clause. You know, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution has been used for federal preemption, which is if the federal government is corrupted, it's often a very effective tool to make sure corporations can't be touched at the state or local level. And I think the growing area to keep an eye on, and I need to learn more about this myself, is the international agreements, where GATT and the global free trade, so-called agreements, are trumping sovereign laws. And I think that's true here in the U.S. as well. And you know, it's not immediate, but I think it's a growing question of, you know, do we retain enough power as people to balance these big, powerful institutions? You picked the last question, so I don't get in trouble.
So, in the back first.
So, okay, we've got elections coming up. So we need to ask people running for Congress if they support what deal. What should we ask them?
Oh, thank you, great question. So what I would ask you to do is, there are elections. So number one, in your state elections, ask for someone to introduce into the North Carolina legislature a resolution calling on Congress to send a constitutional amendment to the states for ratification. And then ask your other state legislative candidates co-sponsor that resolution. So you need to find a champion to lead that, and then get others to join that. And I wouldn't do a lot of worry about, you know, analysis or the votes there or what have you. Just get it in there, and it'll get some debate, and hopefully it'll go further. So state legislative resolution in the State House. We call it the State House. Do you call it that here? The State General Assembly. Thank you. And then at the federal level, ask your candidates, both sides, because we have both sides now supporting this amendment. Walter Jones, ask to join. If they're not, you know, Walter Jones has already joined the People's Rights Amendment. But if you're in other districts, ask them to sign on to the People's Rights Amendment, co-sponsor it, and help move it. And that's HJ Res 88 in the House of Representatives, 88. And then ask them as well to look at 86, which is HJ Res 86, which is the one that gets at the money. So People's Rights Amendment gets at the corporate person issue. Betty Sutton has introduced HJ Res 86, which says Congress and the states could regulate spending of money in elections, state and federal elections. So those are two key pieces. And then we need a Senate co-sponsor for the People's Rights Amendment. Senator Mark Udall, I think it is, from New Mexico, has led an amendment that has a lot of co-sponsors that says Congress and the states can regulate spending in elections, and it overturns that part of Citizens United. We need a Senate co-sponsor for the People's Rights Amendment, the equivalent to HJ Res 88. So ask your senators to co-sponsor that. That's what we want. I mean, I think we need the constitutional amendment. I would also, if they're willing to keep listening and do more, they should do more. We need, you know, I think fair elections now is a good bill, the public financing one. Disclose, of course, we gotta have disclosure. The Disclose Act, everyone said they're for disclosure before Citizens United. Citizens United happened. Disclose got shot down. It got filibustered in the Senate. We should have disclosure, and we don't right now, not adequately. We should have shareholder approval. The SEC could do it now, and so I think ask your representatives but don't let them get away with just doing those and not the bigger power question. Say we want our power back. We need those statutory fixes, but we have a constitutional question that has been called in our country. And we want them to answer that for people, not corporations. So that's the universe and more, I'm sure, of things we want our elected representatives to do. And it's a great idea, Jim, on the campaigns. You want to hear what they think before. So ask both sides. Where do you stand on the People's Rights Amendment? Will you support a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United? And hear what they have to say, and then tell your friends and neighbors. Okay, so thank you very much. I'll stick around.
Everyone again for coming out. Thank William Peace University for hosting us. Jeff will be in the foyer for more questions, signing books. And if you all are interested in this issue a little more, visit commoncauseinc.org. For those of you who are in Wake County, live in Wake County as I do, we've seen our county commissioners take issues, pass resolutions on issues that may not be part of their purview, but I actually think this might be one right for taking before them, and I'm serious about that. So please visit our site and we can give you a little bit more information. Again, thank you all for coming out.
From March 26, 2012, this has been VoterRadio.com's coverage of an address by author Jeffrey Clements on a proposed constitutional amendment to overturn the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Citizens United v. FEC. For more information on Jeffrey Clements, visit corporationsarenotpeople.com. This and other programming can be accessed online at VoterRadio.com.